Okay, I'm back and I'm ready to yap. Okay, here we go. We got team win cons. So we've talked about, win cons for different classes. We've talked about win cons in general for each role, but sometimes you have to take your whole team really into account. And your win con for your whole team in an individual game can kind of shift from game to game quite a bit. And it can even shift within a game, so that you end up, losing the ability to win one way and having to try to win another way. And so let's just kind of try to think of some different ways that you could win a game of League of Legends, because obviously there are multiple ways to win, but when we're being general, there aren't that many. But there are multiple different ways to win. The most standard traditional way that you're going to win a league game is to try to outplay your opponents, get a gold lead and snowball and become stronger than them and then close out the game. So number one would be through obtaining a gold lead. Number two is certain champions in the game kind of have a natural win con, which is what we were getting into, if we were to get more specific with certain champions, where they scale really well. And so if you have a team that scales really well, you don't necessarily need to build up a gold lead. In fact, if you have a small gold deficit with a lot of very heavy scaling teams, you're still really winning the game, because your chances of winning are much higher. And so in a case like that, your win con really is about more minimizing the amount of gold that you're falling behind and maximizing your time into the game. So let's call that, like, for scaling champions, your win condition is time and getting items over time, or getting levels over time. Naturally allowing your champion to progress and become stronger, or your champions to be stronger than the enemy team. Now, another way that you can win, especially depending on, certain roles that you're playing, and especially if you're getting really desperate, is through split pushing, or essentially trying to trade objectives cross map rather than directly deal with the enemy team. And a lot of times, if you're falling really far behind, especially if you're falling really far behind with a comp that doesn't scale, like an early game team comp, you can imagine that if you didn't generate a gold lead and you don't have the luxury of scaling, one of the few ways that you can actually manage to win the game is through split pushing, which is obviously going to be more effective at lower ranks, because if you're able to split push, they're not going to be able to recognize it and deal with it as properly as they should be able to. And your team, if you were to try to group and fight, especially if you're behind anyways, your team is going to be so disorganized anyways, trying to fight as five from a losing position, that a lot of times you're better off split pushing. But I definitely think that split pushing is not just limited to top laners. It's something that is wider, depending on the champion you're playing. It's a much wider concept. So when I play AD carry, which I do sometimes on another account, I actually find myself split pushing a lot on AD carry, and I split push more when I'm losing, because, like I said, if you lose the ability to outscale the other team, and you lose the ability to generate an early gold lead on the other team, one of your only ways to win is through split pushing. So if I know that fights are unlikely to go well since we're already very far behind, rather than grouping with my team and trying to fight over an objective that we're probably losing almost no matter what, trying to fight a team fight that we're probably losing no matter what, I can spend more time split pushing and helping our team actually catch up in gold by at least trading that dragon or trading that Rift Herald or Baron for a couple of turrets. And the turrets actually have the added benefit of providing really two things for you. Not only do they provide the ability for you to potentially end the game another way, even if you're behind or even or getting outscaled, but they also provide gold to your team. So they actually help you come back in the game as well. So they do kind of help with two of these categories at once. They help you to, generate a gold lead or fix your gold deficit, and they also give you an opening, a quicker path to ending the game if the other team messes up really bad. So split pushing is a big one. And then the other one, which I think can really change the outcome of games, is stacking Dragon Souls, because obviously whether you get outscaled or not, depending on what Dragon Soul you get, the soul is such a powerful buff that a lot of times it can allow you to end up winning the game. Similar things with like barons and stuff like that. If you can manage to get a bunch of barons, obviously that's going to help you win the game. It's just difficult to do that if you're behind, or if you're getting outscaled. One of the things that's nice about like Dragon Souls is that if you're that early game team comp and you're getting outscaled, well, you can get dragons in the early game when you're ahead or when the game's more even. And then that gives you a win condition later on, even as you're getting outscaled. Like maybe it's even really looking quite terrible and really rough, and you can't just like start a dragon and get it. You're not in a position to do that. You don't have control over the game anymore, but you at least give yourself that opportunity to potentially steal a dragon and get soul at the end of the game, right? And so, that's a win con. Elder Dragon is another one. Like, it's a really desperate win con that I don't think you're really playing for. But if you're playing a team that's getting outscaled, one way that you can obviously win the game is through coin flipping an Elder Dragon, happening to win that smite fight, or steal that objective away, and then be able to wipe the enemy team and come back. Of course, if you're, getting outscaled, this can be difficult anyways, but the longer the game goes on, the more time will help you, even if you're a team that's getting outscaled. Because in a lot of cases, the game is going to be so even when everyone's full build that even against a late game scaling team, you can find ways to win a game, or at least your itemization becomes close enough that you can potentially win a team fight if you play extremely well. Even against champions that are supposed to be better than you late game, it's possible, right? So it's thin, but it's there. So let's talk about these different win cons and like when you would want to use each one. How to identify, okay, this is a game where this is our win con, right? And so it really starts in champion select. If you are the scaling team comp, and there's a really great video I made called Who's the Beatdown, for League of Legends, which really covers this topic. And essentially, if you're the late game scaling team, the onus isn't really on you to have to do anything in order to win the game. Like we said before, your win con is just time. So if you manage to survive and go even, or even just fall slightly behind against an early game team comp as a late game team comp, you're just going to win out in the end. Scaling is really good in League of Legends right now because even if you fall behind, there's a lot of objective bounty gold. There's a lot of bounty gold on champions that get really fed that you can get. Death timers are really, really short right now, which I think they're actually planning on changing in the next patch. And in low elo, scaling is even better, in my opinion, in some ways, because the games last longer in low elo because people and teams aren't as good at closing out games. Now, that being said, in low elo, some players would say, well, I don't think scaling champions are good. I think that, the game's so volatile that I need to be able to get ahead early in order to carry. And when you see people like smurfing and trying to stomp through low elo, they play a lot of very aggressive early game lane dominant champions. But a lot of reason for that is because they're playing champions that enable them to use their, superior mechanics, let's say, to like bully out low elo players and climb. So I wouldn't say that necessarily for a player who's like silver or gold or below, I wouldn't necessarily say that playing an early game champion would work the same way for you as it would for somebody who's smurfing, right? These are champions that are going to enable the strengths of that player playing at a rank they shouldn't be at, whereas actually scaling champions are quite OP in the current meta because, like I said, they can just buy an incredible amount of time for themselves. And just like dragons are important for the early game team in order to win, dragons can also be important for the scaling team, because even though you're probably not going to be able to get 3 or 4 dragons in a row in the beginning of the game as a scaling team comp, if you manage to nab 1 or 2 dragons with good timing, or you manage to get a kill in lane, get an advantage, get priority and do it, or they just mess up their recall timings, happens all the time. They're, bot lane and their jungler just back and you're able to do a dragon. If that kind of thing happens because of these like tempo mistakes that they're making with their recalls or things like that, even if you're falling really far behind as a late game team comp, because one of the enemy team's win conditions as an early game team is getting Dragon Soul, you buy yourself an extra 5 or 10 minutes if you take one of those dragons or two away. And stealing them is great too, because it's the same deal. Even if your jungler goes in and steals it and dies, if you're a scaling comp, losing one death and a little bit of tempo is not so bad for buying your team 5 minutes into the game. So that is a big one for sure. So we've got time, right, as this aspect. So time is going to be your win con if your team has a huge scaling advantage on the other team. Like very clearly your team outscales the other team. Now, as far as how to identify that, people have pointed this out. It would take too long for me to make a video really going into detail and explaining exactly how well I think every champion in the game scales. So maybe I'll make like a tier list or something. Maybe we'll do a video where I make a tier list of champions, and we'll just kind of briefly go over like groups of champions and their scaling. But obviously, when we think of late game scaling champions, we think of like Aurelion Sol, Syndra, Nasus, Jinx, Kog'Maw. So why are these champions scaling champions? In the case of like a Syndra or an Aurelion Sol or a Nasus, it's because they have some sort of infinite stacking mechanic that's quite powerful. They're Veigar, right? They're infinitely stacking using their ability and their passives. They're able to infinitely stack some sort of advantage or stats for themselves. And so being able to get that extra bonus, whatever it may be, on those champions is going to make them more powerful in the late game. Other champions that are just scale really well and are hyper carry champions like Vladimir, Jinx, Kog'Maw, Kassadin, stuff like this, right? And then as far as early game champions go, you see a lot of champions like if you're playing Lee Sin, maybe like a blue Kayn, things like that. Typically, if you're looking at like, we'll kind of talk about each role. So again, I can't go through them all, but if we're thinking about support, support champions actually do have some scaling, but scaling is probably the least impactful on support of any role. But definitely like enchanters scale the best on support. One of the reasons why I really like Braum is because Braum scales almost like he's an enchanter. He does get outscaled a little bit by enchanters, but he scales almost like he's an enchanter. But enchanters, and then you have like Braum, who scales like an enchanter, but can also play early lane like an engaged support. Then you have obviously engaged supports who aren't going to be able to scale as well later into the game. But they do fine, right? Like a Leona late game is not like something to scoff at. She just does something very different than a Soraka or a Sona or one of these enchanters. So I think an enchanter can do more during a fight, but if a Leona or a Blitzcrank or a Thresh, like gets a pick or hits some really good hooks, or Leona catches somebody with ult that's really important, they can have just as much impact as well. So scaling's not really that important on support. For AD carries, obviously your auto attack reliant AD carries that need items to scale, which are your traditional AD carries like Jinx, Kog'Maw, Twitch, right? These champions need items to scale and are better later into the game. Champion like Lucian, Misfortune, these kind of caster AD carries are typically better early in the game. Kai'Sa's one I think people get confused on. Kai'Sa really spikes around 2 items. And okay, here's what I can do to help you actually. This is a much better idea than me trying to go through all of this. If you go to op.gg, and many sites will have this, but if we go to op.gg and we go to champions, let me pull this up real quick. You can actually figure it out yourself if you don't know. So let's take some champions. Like Leona is the highest pick rate support. Actually, it looks like, okay, Kai'Sa is still the highest pick rate AD carry. Yasuo. And I'll just give you my initial impressions on these champions, right? So like my opinion is that, like I said, Leona as an engaged support will be outscaled by enchanters. but is nothing to scoff at late game, and scaling doesn't matter that much on support. So she will be very tanky and provide a lot of utility in CC in a team fight and probably do fine later on in the game, but maybe not as well as Enchantress, so she might fall off a little bit later in the game. Champion like Kai'Sa is one people get confused because initially Kai'Sa was a very strong scaling champion, but now Kai'Sa really peaks around 2 items and then starts to fall off compared to other AD carries, especially because of her short range. Yasuo is a hyper scaler. Lee Sin is a early game champion 100% through and through. And Aatrox I don't really know too well, but I would assume he scales pretty well actually. So let's take a look here. So what we can do is we can go to trends and we can look at win rate by game length, for example. And so we can see that Leona actually wins the most here between 25 and 30 minutes. It's a little bit worse, but not by much. So don't pay attention. This says 16th, but it's tiny differences in win rate. So we can see here that her win rate between 25 and 30 minutes is 52%. Her win rate here between 0 and 25 minutes is 52.04%. So there's only a 0.01% difference. So don't pay attention to the fact that it says 16th place versus 18th place. But you can see that basically Leona falls off the later the game goes, which is what I said. Like engaged tank supports are better in the beginning of the game. I'm kind of in the way here, huh? They're better in the beginning of the game, and then they fall off, right? Or at least that's the case right now for Leona. If we look at a champion like Kai'Sa, we can see the same thing. In the very, very early game, 50%. She kind of peaks at 51% here, or 25 to 30 minutes. They need a better graph, actually. I don't know why 0 to 25 would be lumped in as the whole thing. Maybe there's a better website. Is LOLalytics going to give me a better graph? Let's see if they have a better graph. Here we go. Win rate versus game length. This is a better graph. We got a few more points on here so we can kind of see what's going on a little bit better. So if we take a look, we can see that Kai'Sa really peaks around 25 minutes, and then actually her win rate drops off and falls off. So Kai'Sa's kind of at her strongest and most likely to win the game between more like 20 and 30 minutes, and then her win rate actually drops off if the game goes later. We could see the same thing with like Leona. Yeah, we can see the same thing here. Win rate versus game length. She does fine in the early game, gets a little bit better during the mid game, and then starts falling off quite hard. If we look at Yasuo, who's supposed to be, I would imagine, a scaler. Interesting. Okay, so Yasuo actually also does well in the early game, but then actually does worse later as the game goes on. So that's kind of interesting. So apparently Yasuo is not a scaler. Well, I guess Yasuo scales really well, but his 2-item power spike similar to Kai'Sa is quite good. So he has a much better chance at winning on his 2-item power spike in this early to mid game. But yeah, so I was wrong about Yasuo. And then Lee Sin, let's take a look, is obviously a very early game centric champion. So we can see here, compared to these other champions, he's peaking earlier than the other champions we've seen at 15 to 20 minutes, the 53% win rate, and then falls off quite hard. And then what about Aatrox? So Aatrox wins very heavily early, actually. So this actually does look like Aatrox is quite early game. But he does seem to scale okay into the late game. He actually does see some improvement, but he's weakest during mid game. So what you can essentially do with this is, if you don't know whether a champion scales or not, I recommend going to LOLalytics or op.gg and just looking up the champion and seeing kind of how their win rate versus game length graph goes. And if the champion is getting progressively stronger, Let's see if we can find a champion that gets progressively stronger, because actually almost all these champions were. Okay, so here we go. Like Jinx is a straight scaler, right? Her win rate pretty much just keeps getting better the longer the game goes on. You know, a champion like Kassadin, I would imagine something similar. Yeah, his win rate keeps getting better the longer the game goes on. So if you essentially can imagine, what you need to try to do in your head is know how these champions, what their graph is like, so that you know Kassadin gets better the longer the game goes on. Leona's good early, but then falls off. Lee Sin's good really early, but then falls off really hard. Aatrox was pretty good early, and then has a rough mid game, and then can do a little bit better in the late game. You know, you need to kind of have an idea of what these win rate versus game length graphs look like for different champions. And if you don't know, you should look them up and kind of get an idea. And then what you're trying to do when you're looking at your team's team comp is you're trying to overlay those 5 graphs on top of each other. And so if you had, you know, let's say all of these champions, right? Like, you know, we know Leona was good early. Where's our strongest point as a team? Do we get stronger over time? Do we get weaker over time? And what you'll do eventually when you get really familiar with the champions in the game is you'll just be able to look at 5 random champions versus 5 random champions and say, yeah, we outscale in top, we get outscaled in mid, we outscale in bot. You know, this happens and that happens. And I basically think that we're stronger at this point and we're weaker at this point, and we outscale or we get outscaled. And then based on whether we're the team that's outscaling or the team that's getting outscaled, that's going to change which one of these win cons we go for. So if we're the team with the Lee Sin and the Aatrox and the Leona that has to win early, we're going to want to make a lot of plays in the early game when we have the opportunity to do that and get ahead, because if we don't get ahead early, we're going to lose the game. So I've talked about in the coin flipping video how you should take certain percentage plays that are more guaranteed and how League is kind of a passive game. One of the things that's interesting is if you're the type of person who plays Lee Sin or something like that, you probably don't view it the same way, because you should be willing, even on the same champion, so even on, for me, like Braum, for example, you should be more willing to take fights in the early game and get aggressive with it and take fights that are thinner than they normally, you know, you would normally want. It's okay to basically take slightly worse odds in a game where you have to get ahead early to win, because you have to make something happen. And so if you're playing the Leona, the Aatrox, the Lee Sin, and you're playing versus the Jinx Kassadin, if you don't get a lead early, you know you're going to get outscaled and lose the game. So your win con isn't time, that's their win con. And so you need to get a gold lead, and you need to potentially split push in order to win the game. Now, you don't have to split push. If you've built up a really big gold lead, you could just play grouped and end up winning the game and closing out the game. So it's not necessarily the case that you have to do both. But if you're the early game team, you should be looking for alternative winning strategies besides time. So you have to build up the gold lead, which means that you need to take more aggressive plays, which means that you have to take more risk, right? Because building up a gold lead represents risk. So some people might say, well, if I'm the late game scaling team comp, I also want to build up a gold lead, right? That would be nice, because then it'd just be easier to win. So shouldn't I just build up a gold lead and take all the dragons and split push at the right time and do this and that? No. Because if you try to build a gold lead by playing aggressively early as the scaling team, you're taking on risk in order to try to generate that gold lead, and that risk will lead to a lower probability of you winning the game than if you play to your win con, which is time. So if you're the scaling team, time is your friend, right? Maybe nab a free dragon, but nothing that's going to jeopardize your scaling and give the enemy team a huge gold lead by throwing at a dragon and all dying. Maybe steal a dragon, maybe nab a dragon if they mess up their recall timings and their tempo. Get a free dragon, give yourself an extra 5 minutes or something like that. If you can't do it, it's fine. Time is on your side, and play to scale. If you're the early game team comp, right, try to generate a gold lead. And if you're losing really badly despite being the early game team comp, and you're not able to get Dragon Soul because you're not winning the game. You didn't generate a gold lead early, even though you had the stronger champions to do so. You're getting outscaled and time isn't on your side. You're really down to that, our only chance of winning is to either open up our options by split pushing, mitigate our gold losses by getting some turret gold back and some objective bounty gold back through split pushing and turrets, slash opening up the opportunity for us to actually be able to alternatively end the game through an open lane. And, if you had stacked up 2 or 3 dragons, but now you're getting outscaled, play to steal them, but don't necessarily play to fight if you know you're going to lose a team fight. Same thing with Baron, maybe play to stall the enemy team by stealing it. And then if you're really desperate and you're unable to split push, or you've done some split pushing, but you're not threatening to end the game and you're getting outscaled, maybe get that Elder Dragon and flip the Elder Dragon. In fact, here's another thing that's really interesting, and some teams actually do this in competitive. It's maybe a little bit hard to coordinate in solo queue, but let's say that you're having a really bad game as a early game team. You actually want the enemy team to take all the dragons. It sounds counterintuitive, right? But you have a better chance at stealing Elder Dragon to win the game sometimes than you do by stealing the 3rd dragon away from the enemy team when you're already getting outscaled, because all that's going to do is stall the game out more without giving you a win con. And so since one of your win cons can be to somehow manage to wrestle away an Elder Dragon, it can be better to get the Elder Dragon to spawn earlier. And so if you wait until each team has 3 dragons, that's a huge disaster because you'll never get the opportunity to play for Elder. Whereas if the other team has already taken 3 dragons, especially if it's not that good of a soul and you're not really going to be able to contest anyways, just let them have it. Or even let them have their 3rd and their 4th dragon so that you can at least have that, couple percentage chance of taking away the Elder Dragon and managing to win the game. So obviously, if you're the early game team, you've got to get ahead. You've got to generate that gold lead. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to play early game champions. It's so hard to play early game team comps because you have so much pressure on you to do that. And like we just said, League is a game that is so much dictated by a lack of information that basically anytime you're doing these very aggressive plays to get ahead as an early game team, it can backfire on you tremendously because if you don't have perfect information on when the enemy jungler is and stuff like that, you can get counter ganked and your whole game can just end minute 3 because you didn't get ahead early. Instead, you got behind early, and now you're against a scaling team that can just bleed you out over time. And so it's a really difficult situation to be able to play early game champions, quite well with kind of calculated aggression. You might not get enough opportunities where you have good information to make quality plays to get your team ahead. So it is very difficult. So let's see. As far as split pushing goes, I'll probably end up making a more detailed video on how to split push effectively, because I don't want to leave people with the impression that they should just suicide split push if they're losing, or that if you're top laner in low elo that you should always just be split pushing to try to win your games when you don't always need to do that. But I do want to say that it's really important to understand when you're split pushing that League and when you're split pushing is a game of this seesaw of pressure back and forth. And if your team doesn't have something they can pressure on the other side of the map when their team comes for you as a split pusher, whether you're the AD carry, whether you're a top laner, whether you're a mid laner who's now deciding to split push a little bit more in the side lane rather than just collecting waves because you realize that in low elo that's a good win con, especially if you're super far behind. Or even certain jungler champions can split push as well, but not most of them. If you're in that situation, what you have to understand about split pushing is that if your team doesn't have something that they are able to trade on the other side of the map, you dying is really bad. So your goal when you're split pushing is not just to suicide split push down the lane, it's to create enough pressure to draw multiple people on the enemy team to you and then leave before they kill you. If you're strong enough that you can fight 1v2, 1v3, and trade a kill, that can be okay. But even then, if you're that strong, do you really want to just die for free in a side lane as opposed to being able to back off and effectively do the same thing in terms of pressure by drawing 2 or 3 people to you and giving your team the opportunity to do something? Another thing that's important to keep in mind, I just said it's important to make sure your team has something to play for on the other side of the map. But just because an objective is up on the other side of the map, like a turret or a baron or something like that, doesn't mean that your team can or will get it. So for example, I see all the time somebody will split push thinking, if I die here or if I push up here and create pressure, my team will take this turret. But their team doesn't have a minion wave to push with, and so they can't actually take the turret. The person dies on the other side of the map. Their team doesn't do anything because they can't, because they didn't have a minion wave to push the turret, and now the guy's mad because he died and it didn't do anything. Similarly, sometimes, even if you draw 2 people to you as a split pusher, it doesn't necessarily mean that your team's going to be able to do Baron. Baron does a lot of damage, especially right now after the changes that they made to it. Its abilities do a ton of damage, and certain champions, even at a numbers disadvantage, can really make it difficult for your team to do a Baron. So certain AD carry champions that could just kind of wipe your team, like a Jinx or a Twitch or something like that, very difficult to play against them, because even at a numbers disadvantage, if they sneak around you while you're doing Baron, they can kind of just shred you. And, certain poke champions like Ziggs, Xerath, things like that, very difficult to deal with those champions if you're trying to do Baron. Or you could be concerned about a steal. So certain champions that are very good at stealing, such as like a Cho'Gath or a Lee Sin or a Nunu or something like that, maybe these things are concerning your team. And so just because you're, winning in a side lane somewhere, or you're pushed up really far in a side lane, or they send 2 people to collapse on you, doesn't necessarily mean your team is going to be able to do Baron. And then you have to recognize that sometimes, even if your team was able to do Baron or was able to take a turret, they're not always smart enough or good enough to do that. And so that's why it's so important for you to not die split pushing, because you can just draw people to you, know your champion's limits, and be able to run away at the right time. And if your team goes for the objective, great. And if they don't, you can try the same thing 30 seconds later on the next wave. And maybe this time, now that, it's been pinged and people saw that they could have done it, stuff like that, maybe on the next wave, they will be able to do it or recognize that they can do it. So it's important when you're split pushing to not just suicide split push down a lane, but to, to actually be able to play around the timing windows, to play the seesaw of pressure between your team actually looking to take an objective. We also see stuff all the time like, players split pushing and their teammates are dead or in base or something like that, which can be fine. It's not bad to, in general, to League is never, a blanket statement almost never works for League. So I'm not saying it's impossible to split push while your teammates are dead, but you can't expect your team to take a turret or take Baron or do Dragon on the other side of the map from you if they have somebody dead or a numbers disadvantage for one reason or another. So in low elo, unfortunately, just like the enemy team is bad at defending against split push, usually the split pusher themselves is not cognizant enough of what's going on in the game to recognize, can my team actually take this Baron or this Dragon, even if they're 4v3? Do I have somebody dead on my team, and so my team's actually 3v3? These kinds of things. Do we actually have a wave to take the turret? Do we actually have enough pressure and enough strength on the other side of the map to win? Do I need to be split pushing at all, like we talked about? Could we just win more easily and simply through grouping? If yes, then probably don't bother with it. If etc. So you get the idea. So to recap, different win cons in League. Some are more common than others. Some are really niche, right? But generally speaking, win cons, when you're looking at your team comp versus enemy team, do we outscale? If yes, then time is our win condition. Making sure that we play a safe, even game, take small advantages that we can get for free, but don't over push it or play over aggressive when we're just going to win automatically through time if we don't troll. Are we playing an early game team? In which case we need to maybe get Dragon Soul in order to win the game, or we need to get a gold lead, a big gold lead in order to win the game, or we need to win through split pushing if our champions are really good at that. So look for those opportunities, right? Like if you fail to do one of those things, if you're failing at one of your win cons, if you're the late game team and you're falling too far behind in gold, right? And you need more time, how can you buy yourself more time? You can split push and get turrets, trade objectives instead of contesting them on the same side of the map. You can potentially pick up a free dragon in the early game if they mess up, or steal a dragon or something to buy yourself an extra 5 minutes to scale. If you're the early game team comp and things aren't going to plan, you're not getting dragons, you're not building up a sizable gold lead in order to win versus a scaling team that you're playing against, look to split push. One other thing that I'll mention before I go is you can, play to get picks, right? This is another classic one, is sure, we're not able to win 5v5. They've outscaled us. They have a better team comp, but get creative with the way that you play the game. Look for those people who are most overextended on the enemy team and pile onto them in that one lane. Or look for your teammate who's most overextended and try to protect them, like we talk about, so that your team doesn't get picked. That's maybe even more important if you're ahead than if you're behind. But play to get those picks, because if you can get a pick using vision, using fog of war, setting up in a spot and getting creative, using objectives to bait people in but not actually trying to do them, and then fighting them, try to get creative with it and get a pick, because there's a chance that while you can't win 5v5, if you're able to use the tools that you have and the utility and the CC and the damage that you have to get a pick, now all of a sudden you're playing an uneven game and you can give yourself a chance back into it. So I hope that this helped you guys identify your team's win con and in different situations. And I hope that if you aren't sure how certain champions scale, that you'll look up these win rate versus game length graphs and kind of get a better idea of whether a champion's an early game champion or a late game champion. And then when you see those champions on your team versus the champions that are on the other team, you'll be able to look at any comp in the game that gets thrown in front of you and say, yeah, we outscale them or we don't outscale them. And that's kind of a skill that I'm not going to be able to tell you, because there's probably a billion combinations of different team comps, right? So I'm not going to be able to teach you, this team is always going to outscale that team, and you're never going to remember the billion different combinations. And it'd take me 2 hours or maybe infinity hours to go over them all. So you just got to learn the champions themselves and then kind of piece it together, kind of in your mind, overlay these graphs. Like, okay, our team all spikes in the mid game, or these champions are good early, maybe we play around them, then these champions are better late, and then we maybe play around them, that kind of thing. Hope that helps. As always, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.